Hello. We have a few more participants who are signing on, but my name is Justin Clement. I'm running the Lunch and Learn series this summer, so we will be waiting for a few more people to join us in this online webinar. But I'm happy to greet you today. We have a pretty good talk lined up. A few points that I'd like to make in terms of events that we have for the Valley Forge Park Alliance coming up. There's Trail Sundays and Trail Tuesdays. For those visiting the park, I do encourage anyone visiting to maintain social distance and keep in mind the safety of your fellow visitors to Valley Forge National Historical Park. Now, the speaker today, Daniel Sieh, I remember when I first saw his name come up on social media, and he had actually made a pair of 18th century crutches to use while interpreting at Colonial Williamsburg, to use while he had some kind of a leg or foot injury. And I remember thinking, I did the exact same thing once. And yeah, I found that quite humorous. And when I first met him at Fort Frederick Market Fair, liked him instantly. So Daniel Sieh is a very competent and experienced living history historian. He has over 8 years of experience working with historical museums throughout the East Coast. Previously, Daniel worked at Colonial Williamsburg and later at Claude Moore Colonial Farm as one of the interpreters there. He graduated with a history degree from the College of William and Mary in 2016. He has a master's degree from American University. He continues to research the history of Asia and Asians in 18th century North America, and we're very lucky to have him here giving us a talk today as part of the Lunch and Learn summer series. So I'd like to welcome Daniel Sieh. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. So, like I said before, I'll talk about Asia and Asians in the 18th century, in particular in England and in North America. So just to start off a little bit of background knowledge. When we think of the 18th century world, we have to understand it is much more globalized, interconnected than expected. The above map over there shows the trade routes used by the British East India Company to carry goods and goods and trades from all over the place, ranging from, the usual suspects like the 13 colonies in the Caribbean, all the way to the tip of Africa, India, and Asia, in particular China. And also, Asia at this time is as complex and I would say interesting as Europe and North America at the time. You have several different nation states, different groups and ethnicities all mixed into Asia. It's not just this monolithic group. I think the primary player you have to understand in this time in 1780s is probably going to be Qing dynasty, the Qing dynasty in China, as well as the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. But even there, you can see that in India, there's several different nation states all competing for dominance in the Indian subcontinent. So it has a complex and rich history onto itself. And just talking about Asian politics at the time could be a talk by itself. But let's just focus on that connection, that communication between East and West, because all of these nations, with their own conflicts, their own struggles, are also networking and communicating with the West at this time as well. And besides just being kind of a one-note conversation, it's actually a dialogue. Goods, services, ideas, and people are going to be exchanged these trade routes. And you're going to see some really interesting combinations and mixes emerging from that. Globalization is nothing new. It's been happening ever since even the 18th century. Case in point, I want to show these two illustrations from China. On the left here, we have what is supposed to be portraying an English man and woman, and it comes from the tributary scroll, circa 1700. It comes from a scroll that was designed and made by the order of the Qing dynasty in China to help educate the bureaucrats and the emperor himself, and who are supposed to be foreign nations on their norms, culture, and how they would even look. And in particular, especially in the early part of the Qing dynasty, there was a lot of interest in the West because it's considered very exotic, very different, to the point where, as you can see on the right, the Yongzheng emperor would actually start to dress in certain Western fashions. We can see He's wearing some sort of Western waistcoat with some sort of robe that's traditionally Chinese, but cut along some Western lines. And his wig, that's a very typical curly wig that wouldn't be out of place in the 18th century. And simultaneously, he's portraying, hunting attire, which is a traditional, Asian custom reserved for emperors. Likewise, we see that echoed across other parts of Asia. Like in this case on the left, we have William Fullerton. He's a member of the British East India Company. He's, clearly English, but if you look at the art style, it's definitively Indian in the motifs in there, the imagery of the servants, the hookah, and everything that's laid before him on the carpet. That's imagery that's also shaded with Indian royalty. So it's interesting to see an English merchant commissioning a painting showing him in an Indian fashion with Indian motifs, associating him and pushing him the narrative that he is indeed royalty and the culture of that he is, serving as a liaison of. And on the right, we have a makimono. So imagine a traditional silk screen in the Japanese fashion. And that's showcasing Deshima Island, which is the only authorized port of entry for a lot of the Westerners in Japan and the Tokugawa shogunate. And you can see that it's, portraying Dutch merchants, African enslaved people. But look at the roofs, look at the gutters, street lamps. These are all strictly Western style. So you can see that we're combining all these aesthetics of both Japanese and Dutch, as well as just regular Western fashion. So as you can see here, we're combining the East and West in just different interesting ways that, underline that complexity and the nuance that these two cultures, very different cultures, are intermixing and having a cultural exchange. And that's also going to apply to goods and ideas. Case in point, porcelain is incredibly popular in the 18th century. It's very fashionable. If you're anybody that's anybody, you're going to be importing porcelain. And it's very fashionable for anybody, nobility, middle class, to have porcelain. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to make, but that's not going to stop, England or France to try to replicate that porcelain. Porcelain is difficult to make, and in China it requires a certain number of minerals and compounds to get it right, including a certain technique in firing it as well to get the right porcelain. Properly made porcelain is pretty durable, and it can even put it directly on the fire without chipping, and is even translucent at times. They try to replicate that in England with the Bullock porcelain factory, and that's where this plate comes from. It's a Bullock porcelain plate from London, dating from 1759 to 1762, and is what we call soft base porcelain. It's basically an English attempt to replicate this porcelain, but because they lack these kind of techniques and materials, the porcelain is nowhere near as translucent or even as durable as the proper Chinese-made stuff. But they still did their hardest to kind of copy that Chinese aesthetic, even though it looks a little bit off to kind of my eyes. And imagine anybody that's particular interest in Chinese porcelain too will look a little bit odd too. Case in point, look at the central figures, these two quote-unquote Chinese people looking at it and walking around and kind of admiring kind of this random vase on the side of the street, as most Chinese people want to do, right? And if you look at the bottom there, you're going to see that there is a bow kind of written on it. And it showcases that, hey, shameless self-promotion. Even these Chinese people are looking at it saying, look at this English vase. It's so good that even we are going to admire it, even though it's self-made porcelain, so not that much better than a knockoff. But to be clear, this happens on, this is a two-way street. So as I've mentioned before, it's very fashionable for people to have porcelain sets. And another extra fashion is to have your coats of arms printed on those, kind of like your own personalized set of, dinnerware. So the way it would work is they would make a sketch of their coat of arms with their notations of what color should be, where, and so forth, send it through an agent who would then commission a porcelain maker in China itself. And then maybe after a year or two, then you'll get your plates back. Unfortunately, these Chinese porcelain makers don't have quite a good understanding of how Western heraldry works. So you have some really hilarious cases of errors in translation over there. So case in point, we have the English arms of Dobry, circa 1755. And on the right, we can see that they actually put in the labels of what colors it should be, and even flipped them entirely. What's supposed to be red is printed in green. It even has a red written on there, and so forth. So it's quite interesting. It's almost like you're ordering something from Wish.com when you don't get what you expect. The same thing's going to apply to architecture. Asian architecture is going to be incredibly popular in England, and particularly interior decorating. This is from Newsom House in the Leeds Museum in the UK. It's dated from the 18th century, and you can see that it's very fashionable, very elegant, combining that kind of Baroque 18th century architecture as well as some Chinese features. The mirrors are definitely Western, but the bottom, the cabinets are done in a Japanese lacquer style that's clearly Chinese, if not Japanese. And right prominent in the center is not only a vase, fireplace, all in the Western style, but hanging in front of them is a Chinese lantern. So it's this really interesting combination of both East and Western aesthetics and interior decoration. And that's not going to be relegated to only the exterior, or interior decorations. Buildings are going to be fashionable too. This is the Great Pagoda at Kew Gardens in London. It was actually commissioned as part of the Royal Gardens by George III. And traditionally, pagodas are features in Chinese culture reserved for storing important religious artifacts or important sacred texts. So the fact that it's put in such a secular, environment as the Royal Gardens is considered a little bit odd, especially in Chinese culture. And even the motifs are a little bit offset as well. Case in point, the dragons on the outside, they're basically a Western interpretation of what a Chinese dragon should look like, long and serpentine. But Chinese dragons, very notably, do not have wings, and on top of that, they don't have a lot of Asian avian or bird-like features. They actually have the antlers of a deer and the face of a tiger, even though here they kind of seem to have beaks on there. So there's this really interesting connection between how the West and the East look at dragons just differently, just on that very particular specific detail on the building. Thankfully, it kind of went out of fashion in the 19th century, and unfortunately the building fell into disrepair. But later on, the 21st century, they actually went back and restored it to its glory now, so you can see it, and I highly encourage you to view it. It's quite interesting. And we're also going to see this kind of taste for Chinese fashion or Asian aesthetics mirrored in fashion as well. Silk is going to be a luxury good that's going to be coveted by the West ever since Roman times. And we're going to see that reflected not only in England, but in the 13 colonies. This waistcoat is from Rhode Island, and it's from Chinese red damask silk. And damask silk is a silk that has a particular embroidery done that's of high relief on there. And it's incredibly difficult to make, but it's very fashionable. Likewise, we're going to see Indian textiles like printed cotton reflected in female fashion from this jacket and petticoat on the right. And I think it's absolutely beautiful. And they're going to be serving as this indications of status and wealth in the 13 colonies and just very fashionable. If you're anybody as anybody, you're going to show off your wealth through conspicuous consumption. And besides just fashion, we see furniture as well. We kind of think of bamboo as this kind of cheap material today, but in the 18th century, it was very exotic because you could only get it from Asia. So you have all of these Western furnitures made to almost emulate bamboo, like these armchairs. You actually see that it's made out of beech, but all the carving and all the painting makes it look like it's bamboo. And it's currently in the Colonial Williamsburg collections. You can actually see replicas of them at the governor's palace, which I highly encourage you to do so. Same thing is going to apply to kind of lacquer work, or as they would call it, Japanning. The name itself is a reference to Japan, which has an extensive tradition of lacquer work, and that's what's called Japanning. It's made out of a secretion of, I think, also beetles and a little bit of different compounds in there, but you get a very striking color, and that's going to be pretty popular in the West as well. This high chest was made in Boston. You can see that it was made of white pine. They try to emulate the Japanese style brasswork with all of the knobs as well, but the entirety, even though it has a Western shape, the details on itself are definitely not wild Japanese, definitely Japanese inspired. But let's get down to the real meat of the issue. We want to understand the people. We have seen objects, and as a matter of fact, property and goods, they're not really new. But what about people? That has something that's been kind of under-researched. And thankfully, now that we've gone back and we're reanalyzing all these kind of past sources, we can actually now take a closer look. And I can pretty confidently state that we can document at least about a dozen or so Asians to North America and about 88 in England itself. I think one of the primary, I guess, showcases of this is going to be this painting by John Hamilton Mortimer, dating from around 1770, curling the Royal Collections, and it showcases Tan Shet Kwa, who's going to be a Chinese traveler that's going to go all the way from around Canton all the way to London. And he's going to be serving as a modeler. He's going to be making porcelain busts and figures, and he's going to make his way all the way to England, where he's kind of really welcome as a fellow artist by all the finest artists of the Royal Academy. And his busts actually become quite the fad in England to own. People are going to be ordering them for about 10 to 15 guineas, which is solid gold coins in England, where most laborers are lucky to earn 5 guineas a year if they're, at best. So it's an astounding amount of money. And it's going to be featured in portrait like we see here today, like a Western, oil on canvas, yet a Chinese subject there. It's going to be featured as well in one of the best paintings of the time by Joseph Zalfani, and this painting by the Academy of the Royal Academy. If you look on the top, middle left, guess who's there? We have Tan Shet Kwa, Chitko, as he's known. So he's just an example of kind of how, even though he's a Chinese gentleman coming in here, he's welcome as an equal and as a fellow artist by all these, prominent artists in England at the time. If you're an artist in the 18th century in England, you better be featured here. That's in anybody who's anybody in the 18th century art world.
Daniel, can you talk briefly about the headwear that Chikwa is wearing in the painting
Absolutely.
by John Hamilton?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. And the headwear that he's wearing there is kind of like this official Qing Dynasty headwear. It's basically, imagine like a straw conical hat that's either covered in rattan or some sort of textile. And at the very top, those are silk tassels that are made, on top that make it very fluffy. And the way that it works is at the very top, you have a finial or some kind of material. It can be glass or a precious stone or sometimes even pearl or even gold leaf. So depending on who you are or what rank you have in this particular Chinese bureaucracy, you get a particular finial, and that denotes your rank. You could also be given like a little ostrich peacock feather as well as a symbol of as an honor. So basically, it's imagine like an easy way for people to indicate your rank and status in society. And the fact that he's wearing that in this painting is a little bit odd because as an artist, Tan Shet Kwa probably wouldn't be a part of the official Chinese bureaucracy, but the fact that he's wearing one might indicate that he's coming here in some sort of authorized capacity by the Chinese government, or that he was just given one as a way to kind of facilitate his travels. And sometimes we're going to see later on in the presentations that sometimes I think they just be given one by English citizens because it's part of their aesthetic in certain ways. It's very fashionable to have exotic looking headpieces in servants as a way to emphasize how quote unquote exotic they are, and it reflects really well on their masters. If that's the case, I want you to emphasize this particular case. On the top left, you're going to see Huang Yitong, who's going to be a younger Chinese gentleman that's going to be following on the footsteps of Tan Shet Kwa. And he comes into England when he's only 19 or 20 years old. So he clearly is too young to have gone through the imperial examination, or at least extremely unlikely. And the fact he's still wearing that kind of official headwear, that tells me that he was just given, it was given to Huang by his master, in this case is John Sackville, the third Duke of Dorset, because he's serving as a kind of like a Batman or servant to the third Duke of Dorset. And like you can see over there on the right, this is a public sketch by Joseph Nash, currently in No Hall. And you can see that he's kind of serving as a servant over there, but he's combining this like a Western outfit, but he's maintaining that Chinese hat. Just a way to emphasize how exotic he is. And not to say that's just a one-way street of people just going to England to serve as either servants or, artists. We also see the case of John Anthony, because two interesting things happened to him. he applies for and is granted British citizenship around the 1800s. And you can see here the sketch by George Dennis the Younger that even though it's unnamed, I really think it is him because likewise in China, you're mandated to have a Manchu queue, so shave the front part of your head and have a long kind of ponytail braided as a way to symbolize your loyalty to the Qing dynasty regime. The fact that this Chinese man is not only rocking a Western outfit, but also not having that Manchu queue tells me that this is probably John Anthony because he's a British citizen. He wouldn't have any requirements to maintain that Manchu queue. And case in point, if you were to touch or cut the Manchu queue, it would be equivalent to treason in China, and it would be liable for execution. And the second part about John Anthony's story that is interesting is that he is hired to serve as a liaison between the British East India Company and all their Chinese sailors they hire to crew all their ships going to China. So the fact that they hire him as first of all implies that they're hiring enough Chinese sailors to justify hiring a person exclusively to serve as a middleman between the company and these Chinese sailors. Like what you see at the bottom of the proceedings of the Old Bailey is a case where he testifies in the favor of one of his Asian sailors, also known as Lascars if they're Indian from the Indian subcontinent, because they're accused of theft. So we can clearly see that there's at least a community there, and they might be, causing some friction in there as well between themselves and the English sailors. Case in point, a lot of these Chinese travelers to England will recount on some of their testimonies to other English people at the time that while the elites and the middle class of England welcomed them quite well, the lower classes accused them of coming to England to quite honestly steal their jobs and drive their wages lower. So unfortunately, it seems that some things never do quite change. And likewise, this case of Chinese and Asians serving as sailors and servants is reinforced in this case of portraiture. Left, we have a painting with Lady Stanton with her son George Thomas Stanton and a Chinese servant. And likewise, on the right, we have a illustration by Gabriel Bray, currently the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, of a possible Chinese sailor. And you can see that he showcases his little party trick. He's able to put his left leg over behind his head. The Oriental part and the title was later added in the 19th century, but I think everything considered, that's probably a fair estimate. So it offers us a tantalizing glance to what a Chinese sailor would look like in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. Likewise, we have Indians from Bengal, Madras, and Pondicherry, coming to England, as a matter of fact. On the left, we have A Servant to the Duke of Cumberland by Paul Sandby. And you can see that he's maintaining that kind of turban that's common in India as a headdress, but kind of modified to suit a more Western aesthetic. And he's wearing, suit, waistcoat, and breeches, in a very Western fashion. But he's maintaining the headdress to emphasize his exoticness and attractiveness as a reflection of his master. And on the right, we have a painting currently in the Staatsliche Museum in Berlin, showcasing George Clive and his family and a Hindu servant on the center. The position of this Hindu servant in particular is very interesting because it's both at the center but at the bottom, so kind of like in a focus yet subservient role in the painting, which might be a nod to the Clive family's fortune because they made their money as kind of governors and government officials in India. So it might be a reference to how they made their fortunes in India. And most interestingly too, we can document Asians in America too as well. And case in point, just as a heads up, when you talk about Asians in the century, they're often referred to as East Indians, as opposed to West Indians, which are the Caribbean. So West India is Caribbean, East India, so imagine India, and probably encompassing most of Southeast Asia. And we can find these, about a dozen or so runaway ads, stating that they're East Indian and based on their physical description, brown skin, black hair. They're definitely probably from Southeast Asia, but unfortunately, because East Indian is a very kind of general term, it's very difficult to necessarily pinpoint exactly from where. We can make educated guesses though, based on where Western settlements are, colonies, as well as trade routes. We can probably assume that a lot of them are coming from kind of the northwest, southwest part of India, around Bangladesh or Bengal. And case in point, if you look at the language, these runaway ads are very similar to what you get for enslaved African Americans running away. So we can imply from that that they're enslaved or they're servants. And even though they're a very low social kind of social class, they're still very distinct to the point where they're kind of described as such. I remember one of them describing them saying like, caught in Perth Amboy in New Jersey, an East Indian man who says he's a servant, very much unlike the Negroes or the African Americans that that you see. So he's clearly different than any African American that person has seen, but he's uncertain to exactly what he is. And we even have Chinese in America too. I'm still digging through more research, is still coming, but we have a headstone which is currently in the Central Burying Grounds in Boston, and it's pretty clear here. It says, "Here lies interred the body of Chow Mandarin, a native of China, aged 19 years, whose death was occasioned on the 11th of September 1798 by a fall from the masthead of the ship Mac of Boston. This stone erected by to his memory by his affectionate master John Boyd Jr." So it's pretty clear that this gentleman is indeed Chinese, and unfortunately, tragic death, but still a fascinating historical archive here. Though I have to remind you that his name is kind of like an exception rather than a rule. A lot of the names we find are usually English in nature. Case in point, I've seen all of them East Indians are referred by English names, or they're given kind of like a butchered anglicization of their native name, which makes identifying them incredibly difficult. The only reason why this gentleman stood out is because his name is Chow Mandarin, which is almost like calling somebody like Tony Italian today. It's pretty clear right there of where he came from, and even there's a clarification in the following sentence too. But that's another kind of like layer of difficulty in my research, identifying that, because oftentimes what we're going to see later on is that they're given English names, and before they just we plowed through their archives and their names didn't ring any bells. They weren't deemed significant. Only now that we're going back onto this, now that we are catching on saying, oh wow, these are actually pretty significant. There's a story behind that. And I think nothing exemplifies that more than the story of Charles Peters. And thanks to the work of John Rees, Joseph Lee Boyle, and Justin Clemens, we see that there's incredible depth about this. And all emerged from this is their description. It's from Halifax, March 14th, $10 reward. Deserted from me the 12th instant of their march for Halifax, 2 soldiers belonging to the 5th Battalion of the state, William Watson and Charles Peters. Watson was deserted 5 times. He has also cost the public 20-odd pounds for taking him up, and jail fees. He's about 5 feet 10 inches high, dark complected, black hair, lives on or near Bay River, below Newburn. Peters is an East Indian from the property of Mr. Tomlinson in Newburn, and it's from the North Carolina Gazette. So we can see here that we can document at least Charles Peters to serve in North Carolina regiments during the Revolution. And thanks to the research by Justin Clement, we're just uncovering some fascinating stories behind him. The fact that he is former the property of Mr. Tomlinson in Newburn implies that he is an enslaved person, and Justin Clement went above and beyond to dig through his story, and he uncovered some fascinating things. So apparently Tomlinson was a Tory in North Carolina, and with the Revolution, the fact that he was a Tory sparked an entire legal battle with Charles Peters using that justification to argue for his freedom and then to join the Continental Army. And later on, while it states that he's from Madras, and one of his dispositions is in court too as well. And we're uncovering a lot. So there's a possibility too that he's in the North Carolina regiments. He was part of several key battles, even as part of Valley Forge as well, during the cantonment there as well, because he returns in the cut of muster rolls later on. So he might have deserted and rejoined the regiment several times. And finally, he was part of the siege of Charleston. Unfortunately, we're still uncovering a couple of things here and there, but supposedly he might even made his way back to Jamaica, but we'll keep you updated as we uncover more and more. Likewise, you have the case of John Newton. He is a member of the 1st New Jersey Regiment under Captain Matthias Ogden, and is just a muster roll, but clearly it says that he's a barber and he's from Bengal with a yellow complexion and talks good English. And there's a possibility that he took part to the battles of, Short Hills, as well as even further on towards the Sullivan expedition as well, and finally Yorktown. So it's really interesting to think about all these, Indian gentlemen serving in, the Continental Line. We also have 2 others serving in the British Army. We have Thomas Smith in this case. His discharge papers state that he was born in British India, and he's going to be serving later on the 29th Regiment as a drummer. And the cool thing about 29th Regiment in this case is that they have a long story of getting black drummers. It's considered very fashionable in the British Army to have kind of this exotic corps of drummers. And they're going to be, I guess, not only using African American drummers or African drummers as well, but also Indian drummers. And there's also going to be, as a further note too, another case of a gentleman called Thomas Buckham, or Buchanum, as he's also sometimes spelled. And even though it's later on, he's going to be, from the 1800s, he's documented coming from also Bengal. That's going to be serving through a lot of the Napoleonic Wars as well, the 29th Regiment, going from Rolisa to Vittoria and to, serving through all the Napoleonic Wars. So we see a lot, like a long history of Asians serving in the British Army. And we also have the case of Charles Bullock too, his discharge papers, and they quote on him as, being dismissed circa 1790 because of being ruptured. Not sure quite what that means. I'm still researching that. But based on his pension book and all of his records, we can see that he might have been at Siege of Savannah, which happened in 1779 too, with his regiment, which is the 60th Regiment of Foot. He's also serving as a drummer. So it's very interesting. We can document at least 4 Asians in the Revolution, dozens in North America, and about 80 to 100 in England. So you can see that even though they're not by any means a large group of people, they're going to having a rather disproportionate impact by the impression they leave on the people around them, and in particular history. And that's why a lot of this research that came about. And this is why I like to research this, because oftentimes when I was working in museums, I was asked by people if I was supposed to be there. And I asked people around me if they have any documentation about Asians being there, and they couldn't really give me a straight answer. They always said, I imagine there should be a couple, but we don't know. So I decided to answer this question. And the fact that I was able to find concrete evidence of them being there, as well as at least 4 Asians guaranteed being in the revolution, that to me is very inspiring, because I think that even though the definition of we the people might have changed throughout time, or how the American people defined who is an American citizen or not, I think their underlying stories have not. And this is my way of getting people who might not necessarily look at the revolution and feel engaged to feel that they belong, that they have a stake in this. And this is like all of our history. Everybody is part of American history. This is your story too.
Building on that, we have a fairly large Southeast Asian population within the Valley Forge area, and we frequently see visitors at the park. And I wonder to what degree should interpretation include these stories? Do you have any recommendations or thoughts on how that inclusivity can be part of the narrative? Certainly at Valley Forge, we have the example of Charles Peters. Awesome.
I definitely think there should be a case made to tell these stories, and oftentimes when I make such propositions, people have connotations that this is revisionist history, or this is kind of this ham-fisted attempt at diversity. But I think it's the exact opposite. I think this is a great example of, I'm trying to strike that balance, say that there's not that there's 1,000 of these people around here. They're definitely a very small minority, but I think emphasizes that the global nature of the American Revolution. It has impacts all across the world, and it's just one element that of these people coming to the new country, trying to strike it out on their own and making new lives. And I think that by striking this balance, by saying I think it emphasizes more of this American story, because oftentimes a lot of people, when they come to the United States, especially if it's just new immigrants or my own family, oftentimes I looked at how the American religion is usually portrayed in media, and I got the impression it's not me, it's not my story. I have no stake in this. But researching, I kind of really fell in love with this and saying, no, there is a stake. And I think by including stories like that, we can increase their engagement and say, no, it is all of our story of we the people. And while the U.S. has always struggled to live up to this reputation of pursuing, liberty, pursuit of happiness, I think by pursuing something like this and telling their story, we can actually start living up to these. So it's a very interesting scenario here. And I think that, in particular, Charles Peters, his quest for freedom by joining the Continental Army is truly a universal story. And I think it really emphasizes the contradictions and say a person joining the revolution to fight for freedom and not necessarily, succeeding at times and failing, getting captured and deserting sometimes. I think that's still part of the American narrative because we, often fail, but time and time again, we keep trying.
We have another question from the audience. Did Chiqua or other Asian visitors to Great Britain or Europe, did they leave behind any papers of their travels?
I'm afraid not. Unfortunately, most of my research is centered around writings done by others about them. If you think about it, a lot of their writings would probably be made in their native language, like Chinese, and brought back with them back to China because Chitqua and Huang and Tong, for instance, they go back to China around the 1790s, 1800s. And unfortunately, because of how the Chinese archives work in the turmoil 20th century, there's probably a good chance that these records have been lost or destroyed.
So there was also another question about an early map that you showed where Sri Lanka was marked as a VOC territory. So VOC, that stands for Dutch East India Company, I believe. I can't pronounce it in the Dutch language, but yeah, certainly it is interesting to think about the fact that the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, they are operating at the same time. The French, Spanish, Portuguese, the Indian Ocean trade is
Absolutely.
Portuguese in particular with the Indian Ocean trade. Yeah. So
case in point, I've seen paintings by the Dutch East India Company showcasing mixed race couples too, and especially early on too, and the British East India Company too. There are also mixed race couples too. We have Dutch traders and English traders intermarrying with Sri Lankan or Indonesian, in the Dutch case, or English, traders and officers marrying to the, Indian nobility families. And a lot of them are going to be having mixed race children too, and a lot of them will go back to England or will go back to the Netherlands and have an impact of their own, which is absolutely fascinating. I just don't have a lot of time to go over that today, and that could be another paper right there as well. So many options, so little time, right?
We invite the audience to ask any questions. Daniel is an expert on this topic. His research, his many little rabbit holes. So certainly, if you have any questions, it'd be interesting to see where that may take us. One question from the audience: could Mandarin and Chow Mandarin's name have been the word Mandarin as a generic term for a Chinese official? In this case, he was a sailor, of course, or a servant aboard a sailing ship. But
yes, that's the name of like a title for an official Chinese bureaucrat. You could call them Mandarin, even though the proper Chinese name is not that. But it's also kind of like a byword sometimes that Westerners refer to as any kind of Chinese person. It could also have been an affectionate nickname too. The best way I can think of is how sometimes we call somebody chief or something like that, even though they might have any official title referring to chief. I think in this case, it's very unlikely that Chow Mandarin was ever any kind of bureaucrat because he's serving as a sailor. That's a labor class right there. Mandarins usually are bureaucrats, and they don't do any sort of manual labor at all.
Yeah. Question on Thomas Smith. He was the drummer for the 29th Regiment.
Yes, he was.
Do you know when he was discharged?
I had that in my notes, so let me look them up here.
Yeah, I'm just curious what years he might have been serving with the regiment. With the 29th Regiment not only being in Boston, of course, part of the Boston Massacre, but afterwards they took part in the Burgoyne Campaign of 1777, ending in the surrender at Saratoga. So kind of an interesting idea to think about some of these individuals and what their service record might include.
1796, I believe. And then he went, but before that, he was discharged from the regiment of the 1788. And then he went to serve on for 9 years in the Pembrokeshire Militia. So 1788 after 9 years, so that's 1797. And then he was discharged with a pension because he was wounded in his left thigh at the Three Rivers in Canada in the year 1786. It is now rendered unfit for any further service.
Do you say Three Rivers?
Three Rivers.
Yeah, Toronto River. Oh, that's interesting.
Right. Imagine, you're born in, Bengal or India, suddenly find yourself in Canada, and then you get discharged. So quite an interesting life story right there.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about Asians adopting European style fashion who weren't in Asia?
Yes. As a matter of fact, it's actually the exception of the rule, as a matter of fact, for them to retain their Asian dress. When they come to England, unless they're serving in a very particular portraiture role, they kind of adopt Western fashions, probably because, as you can imagine, traveling with a large luggage is kind of hard in the 18th century. As a matter of fact, as well, with wear and tear, they have to replace things with what they're given and what they can find, in this case, since they're in the West, Western fashion, but they'll retain a couple of particular accessories. In particular, though, in North America, all of the ads that I find on descriptions, all of them have them traveling and living with traditional Western dress. So imagine them with a coat, waistcoat, and breeches. Not even the headwear seems to remain. The headwear seems to be retained only in the case of if they're servants, in particular in Europe. I mean, granted, there's a case since they're running away, and in America, this kind of headwear would be a dead giveaway that they're running away or they're servants. So they probably wouldn't grab that, but that's still, like, I have no evidence of them keeping those kind of Asian style adornments too much. Maybe jewelry, but archaeological evidence is hard to distinguish that, because if you find their jewelry, it's hard to defer that from what's been imported or what's brought them as their own personal belongings. Oh, and Asians adopting European style fashions, absolutely, all the time. A great example of this is going to be Yongzheng Emperor, for instance. He's going to be adopting that kind of Western hairstyle. He's also going to be seen multiple times where European style outfits. We're also going to see that in Japan. The Japanese are very fond of a particular style of cape that is common in Portugal. It's going to be called a manta, and it's going to be Japanified as a manta or mantal, something like that. It's going to be worn over Japanese armor. As a matter of fact, Western style armor is going to be incredibly popular in Japan too. They're going to be called Western style armor, and they're going to be importing like Morion helmets, but they're going to add like the Japanese crest in the center, the face mask, and everything. The cuirass is going to have the Japanese style filigree there, as those decorations, paintings, but going to be that kind of typical Japanese style in there with a Japanese taste. As a matter of fact, another one too that's going to be pretty common is going to be just kind of Western style kind of materials. I'd say like imagine like medicine, philosophy, astronomy is going to be kind of popular in Asia too as well. Case in point, the Japanese are going to have a whole study group dedicated to just studying the West called Rangaku, or Dutch studies. And a lot of Jesuits too are going to be very prominent members of the Chinese court, because their expertise in astronomy is particularly valuable. And in particular, they're going to help overhaul the Chinese calendar in 1780 that was still going to be in use until the late 20th century, when they switched to the Gregorian calendar officially. So yes, Asians are adopting European style fashion as well as European ideas like all the time. It's absolutely.
So the navigation acts that are part of policy of the British Empire. These acts limit the travel within the British Empire. And of course, with independence, 1783, one of the benefits of independence is that the United States can now travel to areas of the world that they were previously prohibited from doing as part of the Navigation Acts in terms of imports and so on. So 1783, some of the first American trips to China. I mean, this is a direct result of the American Revolution. Can you talk briefly about that?
Yes, and I'm actually researching this right now. So a lot of the trips in the 1780s, 1790s in the early republic are going to be directed towards China because everybody wants tea, everybody wants porcelain. And I think that's where that kind of Chow Mandarin strip came from as part of this in this movement. I found a wonderful research paper that I'm currently pouring through now, but there's a lot of both Indian and Chinese sailors being hired by Chinese companies to serve as sailors of all these ships and American ships going to Asia. And likewise, they have wonderful names. And one of them that stood out to me was a gentleman from Bengal that's called Caesar, but spelled with a K.
So we have one final question. Can you talk a little bit more about the living history impression that we use to advertise this program?
Absolutely.
The blue coat.
Yes, it's me, and for those who haven't seen it, it's a blue coat with that kind of Chinese headdress that I mentioned earlier, the conical hat with the silk tassels on the top. That was based on Wang Yitong's outfit that we saw on the Nash sketch. I just thought it was such an interesting visual that I had to kind of copy that. Plus, I just had majority of that outfit just lying around, with the exception of the hat. So once I sourced the hat, the rest of the kit was easy. But we can see that he kind of has this Western style outfit, but the only thing that kind of stood out was the Chinese hat. So once I saw that, I was like, wow, I kind of want to flex. That looks pretty cool. Let me try to recreate that. It's pretty easy.
Oh, so you said that it in particular was made out of that was covered over with fabric, but underneath it's constructed of what?
Straw or rattan.
Okay.
Rattan is a type of fiber.
Mhm. So I do want to say that Daniel Sieh is a very accomplished living historian. He's part of the reenacting unit, the Jersey Greys of 3rd New Jersey, right? And has participated in 2 of our merchant events here at Valley Forge. So we're very grateful for your expertise, both interpreting to the public at events we've held here, but also for giving us this great program today. And so thank you sincerely for joining us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
So just in ending, I would also like to inform the audience that we have one last speaker series event coming up, and that is on Tuesday, June 1st, and that is regarding tracing your Revolutionary War ancestors. And then the Muster Roll Project is giving a lunch and learn talk next Wednesday, so a week from today, and we'll learn a little bit more about how you can document your ancestor, figure out whether or not they were at Valley Forge. So I very much encourage you to attend both the speaker series event on Tuesday, as well as the lunch and learn event on Wednesday. So do look forward to the e-news. If you're not registered for the newsletter for the Valley Forge Park Alliance, we do encourage you to go to vf.parkalliance.org in order to register, or just check out the events that you'll find on that page. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.